Good evening and welcome to it. My name is Sibs Matiela and this is the Private Property Podcast where we talk about all things property because here at privateproperty.co.za all we want to do is connect you to the heart of property. So we steal about 17 to 20 minutes of your time every weekday to do just that. Today's topic, we're talking about deceased estates and how to sell and buy property in that very unfortunate instance. But before we get to that and today's guest, let me tell you, all roads lead to the property show.
This year, we're back in real life and virtual with content generated in our metaverse studio. We've designed the exhibition space to replicate the world's most popular property game and added in activities for the whole family, including an indoor park and play area. The game board is divided into 4 journeys, namely First-Time Home Buyers Boulevard, Investment Avenue, Sellers Street, and Renters Road. Visit thepropertyshow.co.za for more information and to get your tickets today. The Property Show 2022, 27th to the 28th of August at the Sandton Convention Center. No matter where you are on your property journey, we've gathered the experts.
That's right, folks. You heard it here first. All roads lead to the property show, and that train is moving very quickly. You can join us virtually at the property show from anywhere in the world. We would suggest you be here in real life because you can meet me and so many other people who do what privateproperty.co.za is all about, connecting you to the heart of property. And that's what that show is going to be all about. Please click on the link in the comment section to access some tickets. And I really, really hope to see you there. It's going to be mind-blowing and very much worth it. So if you can make it to the Sandton Convention Center on the 27th and 28th of August, we would really love to see you there. Back to today's episode, though, we are discussing all the things you need to know about buying and selling property from a deceased estate. We are joined via Zoom by the manager of deceased and insolvent estate collections and recoveries at Absa, Anelda Coetzee. Anelda, thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
Good afternoon, Sibs. Thank you for having me. I'm good, thank you.
Let's get straight to it. Please explain to me what a deceased estate actually entails.
So simply put, should a person have had assets or a will during his or her lifetime, upon death, this is called a deceased estate. And assets can include a property, a car, investments, or savings accounts.
Okay, so can you tell me what happens immediately following the death of a property owner now, regarding estate specifically and the property aspect?
No, absolutely. So I think firstly, what is important, once a person dies, a death certificate will be issued and then the estate must be reported to the Master of the High Court. That should happen within 14 days of death. The master then will appoint an executor in line with the provisions of the Act. And then specifically to property, what is important to mention around that is the portion of the property that was owned by the deceased will form part of the deceased estate. And the deceased estate is then administered by the executor in line with the provisions of the Administration of Estates Act. Further to that, what is also really important to note is that the executor will have to establish if there's sufficient funds within the estate to settle. Also includes, the home loan and the balance that is outstanding. So further to that, if the estate has sufficient funds to settle the debt, the property within the estate will then be distributed and transferred to the heirs in line with the provisions of the Act again. But what is also really important to note is that where someone died without a will, the laws of interstate succession will apply to the administration of that estate.
And what do those laws stipulate? What does that mean?
So basically, when someone dies without a will, there is specific steps that also need to be followed and that is, it's specifically with the provisions with interstate succession. There's specific laws applicable to it, how the distribution will take place to heirs. So there's no specific heirs that were then mentioned where that property should be bequeathed to. So there's a specific process that needs to be followed. It's quite complex as well.
And now tell me, if there's still an active home loan on the property, who would actually then have the right to sell that deceased estate's property?
So the executor is the only person who has the authority to administer the estate and to sell the property from the estate. The executor is also responsible taking charge of the assets, seeking claims against the estate, and ensuring that the remainder is distributed amongst the heirs. So with this, the executor steps in the shoes of the deceased, and where the property is jointly owned, the seller will be both the executor and the joint owner. What is also important specifically to property that is sold from a deceased estate is that the heirs will have to consent to the conditions and the manner of the sale. And should the consent then not be forthcoming from the heirs, the executor can then apply to the Master of the High Court for the consent to sell the property. This is an application that should be done by the executor to the Master of the High Court. It has to comply with various criteria to enable it to be considered by the Master.
I'm curious, if the debt of the deceased exceeds the cash that's available, would the property then come into play, and how?
So it definitely can come into play. So if there's no sufficient funds to settle the debt, so what will happen then? There can either be a cash shortfall. If there's a cash shortfall and the heirs are not able to settle the cash shortfall, what will happen then is that the executor will have to consider selling some of the assets, which can then actually include the property as well, to enable the debt to be paid that is due to creditors. And what can also happen, if debt exceeds the assets, the estate will then be administered as insolvent in line with the applicable legislation.
Usually, how much would the value of the deceased estate be, and how is that determined?
So the value of an estate is determined by the value of the assets within the estate. The assets within the estate should be valued at market value as a date of death. What is really important also to note is that should the value of the estate exceed 250,000, this is what we call when an executor is then appointed and a letter of executorship will then be issued. But should it be less than 250,000, that is when a master representative will be appointed and a letter of authority will be issued. So the difference between a letter of authority and a letter of executorship is really that the full procedure in line with the provisions of the Administration of Estates Act is not required to be followed when a letter of authority is issued. For instance, one of the things is the drafting of a liquidation and distribution account.
Can a home loan provider decide to foreclosure on the property at any time?
So what will happen is that should there be a home loan or a credit provider that is a creditor within the estate, firstly, what needs to be done, if you are a creditor, you need to submit a claim against the estate. The executor will then advise, based on the solvency of the estate, if the claim can be settled from the funds available from the estate. If not, they will also have to look at what we discussed earlier, to see if some assets should be sold so that they can enable the debt to be paid. And this includes then on the home loan as well. What will happen then if these options have been exhausted and the claim is still not settled? The home loan provider can then commence with legal action against the estate. This can either take place, in the form of compelling the executor to fulfill his or her functions in terms of the Administration of Estates Act. or to commence with legal action in order to proceed to sale and execution. I must make note, this is, however, the last resort that will be followed.
Listen, Anelda, what should a potential buyer now be aware of in terms of purchasing a property from a deceased estate?
So I think when buying a property from a deceased estate, the potential buyer should definitely be mindful of a number of procedural steps that should be adhered to. If a property is sold from a deceased estate, only the executor can give instructions to an estate agent to market the property for the portion that was owned by the deceased estate upon death. And this is also really dependent on whether the executor has a letter of executorship from the Master of the High Court. The letter of executorship firstly has to be issued, and obviously the executor should be appointed. Sometimes there can be procedural delays in this regard, and the potential buyer should definitely explore with the executor what these can be, because it can vary dependent on the particular circumstances of the estate.
So would you say that the buying process is different from any other process?
Yes, buying a property from a deceased estate is somewhat different than buying it through traditional means. The executor steps in the shoes of the deceased estate as the seller, and where the property is jointly owned, the seller will then be both the executor and the joint owner. So what happens then is once an offer to purchase is accepted and finance is in place, then what will happen is that the executor will then instruct a conveyancer, will attend to the transfer of the property. So to enable the transfer of the property to take place, the master consent will be required. So the master consent is required to be lodged with all other transferring documents at the deeds office. And before the conveyancer can proceed, the application for consent by the master will be required. So in essence, what this basically means is that the conveyancer will attend to the application, lodge a power of attorney with the Master of the High Court, which needs to be stamped then, proving the master's endorsement and consent to the sale. What is really important to note here as well is that the heirs should consent to the sale.
Let me ask you this. I mean, obviously, by the time you're dealing with a deceased estate, it's usually for the heirs and a lot of other people involved, a very emotional time, a very difficult time. It can be a very scandalous time because that's when you find out Papa was a Rolling Stone. Now there's other people coming out of the woodwork to contest the executor or the will and all of those things. In your experience, how long can it take for this kind of thing to be wrapped up? Now, I'm a property buyer trying to purchase a property from a deceased estate that has all of this drama happening around it. What have you seen?
I think that is really where it's important that the potential buyer has an open discussion with the executor so that the executor can advise, of the potential procedural delays that can take place. It's important, that when a property is sold, that the heirs' consent is also in place so that you don't have those delays down the line, because it can vary from estate to estate, especially because the consent is required from the master.
Anelda, thank you so much for joining us. Anelda Coetzee, Manager of Deceased and Insolvent Estates Collections and Recoveries at Absa. Thank you so much for joining us today and for all of the insight that you've brought to today's episode.
It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I look forward to talking to you some more because I feel like there's a lot more to unpack when it comes to this particular topic.
Thank you so much. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye. Listen, it is competition time. It means someone who's watching is going to walk away with a whopping $500 in cash and a ticket to the property show. Oh, what's the property show? It's happening on the 27th and 28th of August at the Sandton Convention Center. And that's where we show you all of the things that we discuss on the podcast: property, the lighting, the deceased estates. We give you information about bonds and smart houses and AI and all sorts of other fun things. So you should definitely be there. But someone here has won a ticket, and that is Tintswalo Chauko. Congratulations, you've got $500 coming your way, and we will see you at the property show. That has been today's episode. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. I've been Sibs Matiela, and this is the Private Property Podcast.
This year, we're back. In real life and virtual, with content generated in our metaverse studio. We've designed the exhibition space to replicate the world's most popular property game and added in activities for the whole family, including an indoor park and play area. The game board is divided into 4 journeys, namely First-Time Homebuyers Boulevard, Investment Avenue, Sellers Street, and Renters Road. Visit thepropertyshow.co.za for more information and to get your tickets today. The Property Show 2022, 27th to the 28th of August at the Sandton Convention Center. No matter where you are on your property journey, we've got